Well, Bob, it's not just about Bob. It's all the stories and the history that Bob has learned in this community. I mean, he is an encyclopedia. He is an archive of stories that people need to hear about. I'm Deborah Hensley, and this is Deborah's Social Stimulus. Bob was involved in the subculture, as I would put it, in the gay and lesbian community back early in the 60s and the 70s. But more importantly, he's met people all over the world who are drawn to Lexington, Kentucky. And then he knows people who've been here for their entire lives that have never really gotten beyond their own streets. So he knows just about everyone that's unique and compelling in this community.
This was a small southern town full of eccentric characters, but it was also a town that was a crossroads of the underbelly of the South. All the talented kids left rural Kentucky, and the first stop was Lexington. So there was always this exciting thing going on. I came out when I was 16, so that was quite a while ago. You know, that was definitely early 60s, pre-Stonewall. And, you know, my father was a really great guy, and I really loved my father. And, you know, and he was always okay with me being with some of these people and with me identifying gay way before it was a comfortable thing to do. I was a young kid running around downtown when I was a teenager, and I inevitably met some of the most flamboyant and notorious homosexual characters in Lexington. One of the oldest characters that I knew was Sweet Evening Breeze, who was a black man who walked the streets in drag from the time I was a little child. I remember my father would yell, "Here comes Sweet Evening Breeze," and all of his kids would stand up in the back seat of the car, and we would all hang out the window and yell and wave as we would pass Sweet Evening Breeze, who was walking the streets in drag. And then I grew up and got to know him and became friends with him, and used to go out dancing and partying with him. I went to his house and found out he was born in the 1800s. You know, and at one time urban renewal took most of downtown, white flight had sent people to the suburbs, and gay culture flourished, and the art community flourished in downtown because no one cared about it anymore. We had all these great big old buildings we could rent for nothing. We could run the streets wild, dressed crazy, and police didn't even care, you know. Nobody cared what happened downtown. You know, with this package of getting all these young creative people into Lexington, Lexington would get full every now and then. And you know what? Lexington had great talented people, and they moved on to New York, San Francisco, Miami, places like that, where we had lots of members of our community living and established in the arts, working in ballet, working in theater, working in music. There became this pipeline of creative kids passing through Lexington and going on to the big cities where the big gay communities were, you know. And they would come back pretty regularly to visit family, to spend time with their friends. So we always had this wonderful saturation of what's happening really in the big cities right here in our little town. And that was wonderful. It fed us for many years, nourished us. I lived away. I moved to all the big cities, you know, because that's what we did. You know, we'd get bored with Lexington and say, "I want to live, let's go to New York," you know. People would go stay in New York for a year, get jobs, work in the theater, do, you know, all kinds of stuff, you know, and find wonderful careers. And but that also put everybody that we knew who was beautiful and creative at ground zero for the AIDS epidemic. It was this terrible thing of, like, you know, you had to leave Kentucky to actually pursue your careers and being taken seriously, and that every one of those boys especially came home in a box. And these families that they had left behind, some of which who were even reasonably clueless to the fact that they had these children who were out and living gay lives in the big cities, you know, the scare and the horror of the early part of the AIDS epidemic in our community was palatable. And people that I knew that were like beautiful, important, talented people died and were forgotten, uncelebrated, and their families were shamed by them and shamed by their deaths. And I promised a lot of the people from those days that I would never forget what happened to them, and I would always tell their story. So I'm tasked with finding a way to reinvent that every time, because it's a story of unparalleled suffering and horror that nobody wants to hear. So how do I package that story so people say, tell me more, you know? So that's what I do with my art to a great degree. There were no social workers, there were no outreach organizations. The only major hospital in town wouldn't even take people through the emergency room, you know. I mean, it was shameful. And members of the gay community hid. Everybody hid, you know. There were very few people in the trenches in those days. I already knew how to take care of people because I'd always taken care of my mother. I'd always taken care of my sisters. You know, I'm one of those people, you know. But I never saw myself as the kind of person who could take care of people, who had a talent for that, you know. And I had no intention of taking care of sick and dying people, except there was no one to do it. And there were people I loved with no resources at all. We would rent an apartment, put mattresses on the floor, and say if anybody knows anybody who needs a place to come, they can come here. All the prevention work and all the activist work was being done by individuals. I was passing out sterile syringes in the African American community, which are illegal, you know, in Lexington, and, you know, and I'm like, you know, like doing all kinds of crazy stuff, you know, because stuff had to be done, you know. I volunteered to take someone to a clinic. I go to her apartment, it's the middle of winter. It's a black woman sleeping on a mattress with no utilities and not connected to any services. Up until that point, all the knowledge of HIV/AIDS was held by white men. And as soon as they all learned something, they died, and it had to be passed on to the next person who was next in line of being healthy. And it kept being passed on. Black people were dying early in the epidemic, but they were considered so expendable compared to white men that they weren't even counted. I became that woman's caregiver, and she is still alive today. And struggling. You know, I spent a lot of time with young marginalized drug addicts in this community. People would not believe the horror that goes on in that world and how little resource is given to these kids. Bad kids are really drawn to my art, you know. Bad kids love it. They can smell it a mile away. And so if I set one of my pieces out somewhere, they just gather around, you know, like they're ready to do something, you know. So I started using all the stories I tell in my artwork about the beautiful people that I know and love that I promised I would never forget their story or let anybody forget what happened to them. I started telling those stories to these young kids who loved them. One day I got a photograph that I wanted to put up here. And so that led to, one thing led to another, and now it's like become this little altar of all of its own, but it's like guarded by the Egyptian god Anubis. This is my buddy AJ. He lived here at the house for a while. He was this wonderful, really creative musician. I met him when he was like 17. He was living under the bushes in Woodland Park. And over the next 5 or 6 years, we got to be friends, and he started hanging around my house, hanging around my studio. He was drawn to my art, and we became really big buddies. And over the next, and he lived reckless, too, very reckless life, and which worried me. AJ lived to be 25 years old, so we knew each other for 10 years, and he struggled with a lot of dark demons from his childhood. And I love that picture of him. He's smiling. I've got actually some envelopes of hair and little urns of ashes of dear friends. This is a beautiful little cloisonne urn that has the ashes of my friend Joanne in it. You can hear her rattling in there. Young people, young creative people, and young gay people in the community seem to be the people who struggle the most and go way below the radar. So I've got a lot of their stuff that they leave here in the house, pictures of them and things that they give me, little toys and trinkets and stuff. I have these wonderful swords here that I love. These are the most low-tech for fighting the forces of darkness. I got the house, gave the key to 2 young graffiti artists, and told them, go to the bedroom and do every square inch of it in street graffiti. And and whatever you want to do, whatever colors, and I'll come back in a few days and take a look at it. And I gave them each $100. And this is what they did. I love the fact that when the door is closed, you can't see the door anymore. You know? I have a lot of friends who are artists, you know, and so I tell people that if you want to collect art and you don't have a lot of money, start inviting artists to dinner because they're all starving, and they will love you for feeding them, and they'll eventually give you art or give you such good deals on art. You know, you'll end up with financial insecurity has always been a problem in my world, and these days, you know, my little world teeters near bankruptcy every month. But I work 5 different jobs besides my art career. But I just want to keep people focused on the fact that, you know, I'm an artist and an activist in the community.